context, because there's a way in which NYU and the work that was done, especially from around 2013, 2014, and 2015, was a bit of a spark for me as an artist and as a thinker in really thinking about Blackness and thinking about what kinds of conversations were possible in this city that has been my home for so long. And so I'm really grateful to the work that has been done before me in this space, and really grateful to have had NYU Florence as our partner from the very first edition of Black History Month Florence. This is the 6th edition. It's framed under the thematic title Ostinato. So really thinking about the sort of persistence that is required in any sort of social work, in any sort of real engagement of history. And also it's sort of coming out of music and the ways in which in music, especially if we think about jazz in the context of ostinato, you need this sort of ongoing baseline in order to give space and freedom to the musicians to improvise and to be able to really create their own paths. And so this is about us, Black History Month Florence, really working to create some form of pulse or baseline that gives space to everyone to be able to riff on. And so tonight, we are particularly happy to be partnered with also the American Academy in Rome, another institution that we've been partnered with from the very beginning through various exhibitions, conversations, and I still recall our very first edition with the contribution of Senam Okudzeto, who was then a fellow at the American Academy in Rome. And we are super happy to have Melanie Masterton Sherazi with us tonight to talk about a subject that for me is a particular interest. I've always liked to think about the ways in which Italy has been a site for cultural production for so many people that are not from here, and the ways in which these voices coming into this space begin to narrate aspects of history in ways in which really helps to wake up for a local population what this represents to others. It's a way of seeing ourselves. And I think that, this conversation is one that I think has been undervalued overall, especially in a context like Florence, where a lot of this is seen through the lens of tourism and not through the lens of people that are really engaging in forms of research in these spaces and engaging in forms of production of art and writing and everything else. And so I'm particularly excited about this conversation for that reason. I was listening to an interview from 1970 with William Demby, in which he was talking about an inspiration coming from a meeting at Palazzo Vecchio in Florence. And there's something really magical about thinking about the impact of him looking at a tapestry and being inspired to sort of reframe and rethink narration in writing. And so it's really exciting to think about just those subtle things that really shift a perspective. And I'm hoping that we'll have the opportunity to dive into that. I'm gonna go ahead and read Melanie's biography, and then I'm gonna share with you a really tiny video fragment from that 1970 interview, just to sort of get us started, and then we'll dive straight in. Towards the end of Melanie's presentation, we'll have space to collect questions in the Q&A box. So feel free to write them in, and we'll attend to them in the end. I'll be feeding them directly in. So to begin with, Melanie Masterton Sherazi received her PhD in English from the University of California, Riverside, and is a former UC President's Postdoctoral Fellow in English at UCLA. This talk comes from her manuscript in progress about Black American writers and artists, genre-bending cultural work in Cold War Rome and their Italian creative cohorts in the cinema and literary and visual arts. In spring of 2021, Sherazi will be in residence at the American Academy in Rome as a Terra Foundation affiliated fellow. Her scholarly work appears in journals including Modernism, Modernity, Italian Quarterly, Ariel, Melus, and is forthcoming in Pacific Coast Trilogy. So I'm super happy to have you here, and I'm going to start by sharing this really brief video. This comes from the Writers Forum's videos, and it's William Demby in dialogue with Peter Marchant, and Pat Ryan. And so I'll share with you just a tiny piece of this.
You said that you don't trust history. History hasn't given us the truth.
No.
And through the novel, you still, that word works for you. You
Yes.
still think that it's possible to tell some truths, and it's a mission, it's a mandate.
You spent 20 years in Italy, and from the point of view of these last most painful 10 years, Rome looks like a very attractive place to be. And I think you said that it was easy to be black in Italy, that there's not the pressure that there is here. But you've come back to the States and you've come back to Staten Island. Why?
Per rispondere a questo dovrei forse dirlo in una lingua che tutti non possono capire. Sono tornato sì, ma that's the answer. I really don't feel this division of being here or there. I think it would be more traumatic for me to have gone to, let's say, Los Angeles, from where I'm from Pittsburgh. You know, all of these things are just moving. We have this tremendous mobility, not only physically by jetting back and forth, but also the mobility that comes from our perceptions of images and so forth over the TV screen. The Vietnam War has to compete with Budweiser beer for the attention of Americans in their homes. I don't feel really being there. I don't think that the cultural things are like they were when Henry James went to Rome in some kind of an attempt to capture the culture of the old land. I don't think it's like that anymore. I am always astonished when people place importance on where I was when I was writing.
But you want...
So with that, I will turn the microphone over to Melanie. Thank you so much for joining us.
Well, let me begin by thanking Justin Randolph Thompson for inviting me to participate in this year's program and by sharing my admiration for the truly vital programming that Black History Month Florence has delivered these past years, and now in really this most challenging of years. I'm also very grateful to the American Academy in Rome and to the Terra Foundation for their support of my work. So today, with a focus on William Demby's genre-bending writings from Rome, I'd like to share with you from my manuscript in progress, which situates post-war Rome as a hub of experimental Black American cultural production and expands our frame of reference beyond Paris, which is so often read as the center of Black exile and political critique in this period. My book analyzes how Black American writers and artists working in 1950s and 1960s Rome, including Demby, Maya Angelou, Ralph Ellison, and Barbara Chase Rabu, among others, infuse political content into their cutting-edge aesthetics across genre and medium, including fiction, life writing, journalism, visual culture, performance, and cinema. Their work defied enduring binarisms of segregation, fascism, and colonialism, and conceptualized the US Black freedom struggle in transnational terms. My book also considers how, through their collective presence and collaborations with Italian leftist filmmakers and artists, Black American cultural workers contributed to Italy's total cultural transformation amid fascism's and colonialism's undoings, processes that remain, as we know, incomplete and ongoing. Black American cultural production from post-war Rome reckons with political content through disjunctive temporalities amplified by the Eternal City's own layeredness, and often with difficult media blurring forms that promote a radical heterogeneity that resonates in our present. Black US-based Publications like Ebony, Jet, and Our World provided their readers with ample coverage of African-American writers and artists thriving in post-war Italy, including Demby, Ben Jonson, John Kitzmiller, Catherine Dunham, Ada Bricktop Smith, and Owen Dodson, among others. This coverage estranging Jim Crow segregation and racialized violence in the United States. The post-war Italian press, too, across the political spectrum, maintained close attention to US race relations and support for the civil rights struggle, as Frank Snowden Jr., author of Blacks in Antiquity and a cultural attaché in 1950s Rome, began documenting in the 1940s. Snowden observes the embrace of African-American soldiers by Italians as liberators and the popularity in post-war Italy of African-American cultural production as sources for this attention in the press. By the late 1960s, many Black American writers had been translated into Italian and were being studied, including Zora Neale Hurston, Langston Hughes, Richard Wright, Ralph Ellison, and James Baldwin. So in keeping with these contexts, I'll turn now to William Demby's dynamic career in Rome. Demby had been living in Rome for 15 years when he was invited to host a landmark 1962 episode of the Italian variety television show Il Signore delle Ventuno, filmed at Rai Studios. The show's episode, titled Harlem, featured an all-star lineup of African-American performers, including Louis Armstrong, Sammy Davis Jr., Hazel Scott, and the Peter sisters. Demby had the idea to call out in Italian, "Hey Louis, what's Harlem?" To which Armstrong responded, "Harlem is," then launched into his set. Some 15 million Italians viewed the program. Affirming the role of culture in the US Black freedom struggle, Demby wrote of the event with pride in a letter home to his parents, commenting, quote, "I think the episode did much for race relations." Demby's letter home, sent in August of 1962, also details highlights from Demby's most recent work in the Italian film industry. Demby and his wife of nearly a decade, Italian writer Lucia Tatina Drudi, co-wrote the screenplays for Congo Vivo, a Giuseppe Bonatti film starring Gene Seberg and Gabriele Ferzetti as lovers, and depicting the decolonial struggle with documentary and narrative footage, and Marcio Crepa, a Frank Weisbar film starring Stuart Granger about the French Foreign Legion's final days in Algeria and a futile mission to capture an FLN resistance leader. Demby brought to these anti-colonial films his experiences as an international journalist who had traveled to East Africa, Japan, and the US South in the Cold War 50s. In the midst of such cultural labor, Demby was working on a second novel, The Catacombs, the focus of my talk, whose formal experimentalism, attention to transnational liberation struggles, and articulation of a Black female expatriate artist's voice call for renewed critical attention. Demby channels his work across Rome's culture industries, calling on journalistic techniques and a filmic sensibility to generate his 1965 novel, The Catacombs' breakthrough surface aesthetic, dispelling in the process the false binary between Black socio-political protest fiction and representation on the one hand, and so-called apolitical high modernism and abstraction on the other. I had the great privilege of being the first researcher to inventory and conduct research into William Demby's papers from Rome, which are now housed in his son James Demby's historical residence. James Demby, a composer and professor of music in Florence, generously welcomed me to work with his father's papers, which include drafts, correspondence, scripts, ephemera, and photographs. My time with William Demby's archive provided me with rich but often elliptical content that inspired my years-long research to document and analyze experimental cultural production from post-war Rome, and Black American writers and artists' collaborations with Italian filmmakers and artist cohorts in this period. Demby is a key but under-acknowledged theorist and practitioner of Black internationalism. The contents of his domestic archive signal the extent to which he wove his experiences as a journalist and translator, screenwriter, and actor for the Italian cinema into his most well-known novel, The Catacombs. Without drawing direct correspondences between Demby's life and work, his life narrative and my archival research to recover that narrative is significant to reading his writing, as Demby consistently injects and plays with autobiographical events and insights across his oeuvre. I'll share with you biographically significant aspects of his time in Rome and about his cohort to gesture toward the ample work that remains to be done in the emerging fields of Black Mediterraneanisms and Black Italy at mid-century. After having served in a segregated troop in Italy during World War II, Demby returned, a Fisk University graduate, to live in Rome in 1947, preferring the Eternal City, in his own words, as the grittier alternative for an artist to staid Paris. He fell in with an Italian cohort almost immediately, moving in with leftist artist and filmmaker Renzo Vespignani, who read Antonio Gramsci's writings at the dinner table, and artist Marcello Muccini among his roommates in a fifth-floor walk-up on Via San Teodoro overlooking the Forum. Living in such incredible proximity to the ancient city, I argue, infuses Demby's post-war writings with a sense of deep time's coexistence with the aftermath of World War II in terms of historical cycles of rupture, retrenchment, and recursivity. Gasparo Del Corso, owner of the Roman art gallery L'Obelisco, dubbed Demby's leftist circle La Banda di Portinaccio, or the Portinaccio group, after the working class quarter of Rome, where Vespignani grew up and which was the radical setting of many neorealist films. For his part, Demby frequented his friends' art studios on Via Margutta, and art historians Barbara Drudy, Silvia Lucchesi, and Peter Benson Miller have traced the compelling extent to which Demby was in dialogue with and influenced by post-war Rome's avant-garde visual artists. Demby's marriage to writer Lucia Drudy in 1953 made news in Italy and the US and immersed Demby further into Italian life. Like Demby, Lucia Drudy worked across Rome's culture industries as a screenwriter, poet, novelist, literary translator, and literary agent. Of Demby's Italian cohort, many of whom make appearances or are referenced in the Catacombs, it is Lucia Drudy who is his central creative interlocutor. So to the Catacombs. Innovating the long Black autobiographical literary tradition, the Catacombs semi-autobiographical narrator, Bill Demby, is an African-American novelist and script translator living in Rome with his Italian wife and son. From the opening pages, Bill Demby informs the reader that he is writing a novel about Doris, a young Black American dancer living in Rome and working as an extra in the colossal studio film Cleopatra. Bill Demby's novel Within the Catacombs stages Doris's interracial love affair with an Italian count, Raffaele della Porta, and in which Doris often mocks her exoticized presence as a Black woman in Rome. The Catacombs' tripartite structure juxtaposes a metafictional emphasis on the act of writing a novel, and the Black American authored novel in particular, with filmic scenes from the novel Within the Catacombs, starring Doris, the Count, and/or narrator Bill Demby, with journalistic content montaged by Bill Demby from the daily English and Italian language newspapers during 1962 to 1964. The Catacombs does not aim to synthesize such simultaneity nor advocate for a grand totality. Meta-theatricality in the vein of Luigi Pirandello commingles with documentary realism and modernist abstraction. The built environment of Rome is both a character in the novel, as Ugo Rubeo argues, and the site of radical incoherence, where the ancient coexists with the early modern, the fascist, the post-war contemporary, exploding singularity. Accordingly, reality is multiple and simultaneous in the novel. In a passage thick with layers of mediation, narrator Bill Demby describes viewing the aforementioned broadcast of the Harlem episode of Il Signore dell'Evento in his home with Doris and the Count, fictional characters from his novel Within the Catacombs. So I'll read a bit from this long quotation. I know that this is the first time that so many Negro entertainers have appeared at one time on a European television program, and I'm frankly apprehensive. Strange things happened during the Ampex recording of the program. For years, I had lived under the illusion that racial prejudice does not exist in Italy, which has now become my second patria. And yet, had I been imagining things? The author William Demby writes home to his parents that the show was well received by its Italian audience. Narrator Bill Demby alludes to a counter narrative that unfolds behind the scenes of the show's production. Characteristic of the Catacombs' commitment to what I term a surface aesthetic, it moves on without further commentary from Bill Demby or his characters about the episode or their perception of its significance. Nevertheless, the suggestion of racial prejudice lingers, unsettling idealized interpretations of a utopic, colorblind post-war community in Rome, given Italy's then recent history of racial laws and colonial incursions in North and East Africa. Amid such complexities, Rome was the center of a thriving film industry in the 1950s, dubbed Hollywood on the Tiber, affording opportunities, as Jet Magazine pointed out, that were simply not available to Black artists at home. William Demby threads into the Catacombs his frequenting of the filmmaker haunt, Cafe Rosati, on the Piazza del Popolo, a setting that recurs in the novel, for instance, as narrator Bill Demby waits for filmmaker Pier Paolo Pasolini to join him at Rosati to discuss Demby's novel in progress and Pasolini's latest project, Mama Roma, starring Anna Magnani. Harking back to a decade before, William Demby was walking toward Cafe Rosati when Roberto Rossellini's car pulled up beside him, and he was offered a cameo role in the director's current project, a short film titled L'Invidia or Envy, for a 1952 anthology film, The Seven Deadly Sins. Demby enters a gathering of friends and takes the center of the frame, perched above the other guests, calling attention to his exceptional celebrity status as a Black American writer in Rome. Not long after William Demby worked as the assistant director of dialogue on Rossellini's Europa 51, based on a story by Federico Fellini and starring Ingrid Bergman. Bolstered by his reputation as a talented novelist with his debut novel, Beetle Creek, Demby quickly earned a name for himself with his witty, idiomatic translations of Italian scripts into English, and was offered steady work at Cinecittà and by producers like Carlo Ponti and Dino De Laurentiis. Drawing from his work in the Italian cinema, Demby maintains an attentiveness to performativity in the Catacombs, spotlighting the novel's characters donning masks and delivering lines. This content unfolds as a series of stylized scenes in the novel and in Doris's long letters home, which read like dramatic monologues. Demby himself appeared as an actor in Camillo Mastrocinque's Anna's Sin, or Il Peccato di Anna, a retelling of Othello set in 1950s Rome, starring his friend Ben Jonson, who appears multiple times in the catacombs. Jonson was the prolific translator of experimental Italian writers into English, including Italo Svevo and Italo Calvino, and was married to translator Liana Macellari. This is a time of possibilities in Rome for Black American artists to work steadily, even as Shailene Green rightly notes that Black actors' roles in Italy, including in Anna's Sin, often trafficked in male stereotypes around hypersexuality and drunkenness. Narrator Bill Demby's scripting of his novel Within the Catacombs, starring Doris and the Count, interestingly shares several metatextual elements with the film Anna's Sin, featuring a story within the story, the presence of Black artists living in Rome, and an interracial love affair across class lines. Alongside the filmic, the Catacombs draws on Demby's journalistic methods, amplifying its multimedia innovation. Against modernist depth and interiority, Demby's The Catacombs fashions a surface model of the early 1960s that brings micro and macro global events into collision, but without commentary, through textual montages of the news as selected by Bill Demby in Rome, enacting what Sarah Marzioli terms a performance of historiography. Often translated by Demby from Italian, these montages deliver a time-space compression of the era's tumultuous events and solicit the reader's interpretation and participation, relying on the newspaper snippet citationality, their ability to break with and enter into endless meaning-making, narrativizing contexts. The Catacombs is a novel of making, of bricolage. Demby's work in journalism directly informs the Catacombs' experimental form and radical content. Nearly a decade after his expatriation to Rome, in 1956, Demby traveled for several weeks through the US South with some trepidation and great critical distance on assignment for Reporter magazine to profile the civil rights movement. After witnessing firsthand the ingenuity and solidarity of the Montgomery bus boycott protesters in action, he published They Surely Can't Stop Us Now, which profiles a number of Black women in the movement, including principals, teachers, and social workers, and includes Demby's own first-person perspective on being relegated to segregated bus travel and restrooms. On his way back to Rome from the US, Demby stayed with writer Richard Wright in Paris, evidencing the rapport between artists in these two metropoles. Among Demby's archive is an entry in a red notebook about the two discussing Wright's inspiring participation in the Afro-Asian Bandung Conference in Java. And Demby notes that he and Wright shared the feeling that the Algerian struggle and the Montgomery bus boycott were interrelated revolutions. This transnational sentiment turns up repeatedly in the Catacombs as Demby juxtaposes news of the Algerian and the US Black freedom struggle. Demby's journalistic trip through the US South and his subsequent visit with Richard Wright in Paris are key points en route to his writing of the Catacombs. An early sign of this is clear in Demby's pairing of newspaper materials in an article he wrote in Rome in April 1956, immediately after his trip to the US South and to Paris. Demby opens the article with the query, are the Algerian rebels planning a Montgomery-type boycott in Paris? Reports reaching here this week indicate that Algerian residents in Paris are awaiting secret orders to begin a war of civil disobedience to hasten their independence from the French. Demby closes his article by pairing two quotations cited from separate articles that appear on the back page of an Italian language newspaper. "I can't say how long the liberation campaign in Algeria will last," says Mohammed Kader, the FLN leader based in Cairo, "but we're going to keep on fighting to the very last man." Says Reverend Lambert in Montgomery, Alabama, "We're not going to end this boycott until segregation in Montgomery is brought to an end." Again, Demby lifts these quotations from two disparate articles, translating them from Italian into English and juxtaposing them together in a new context, his own news article, foregrounding these transnational liberation struggles as explicitly enmeshed as he and Wright had discussed, and here formally juxtaposed on the page. His piece ends, "History speaks." We can see how this technique from the 1950s evolves in one of many such media assemblages in the catacombs. Adding further texture to the catacombs' attention to heterogeneous but interconnected liberation movements in the US and in North Africa, Demby presents at the textual level women's liberation and anti-colonial resistance as inextricable struggles. One of the novel's central events is the suicide of Bill Demby's friend Laura, a West Indian woman living in Rome and married to an English poet. Demby, who's very close to the actual suicide of his friend, Lola Segre, a Jamaican woman who was married to an English poet, Patrick Cray. In the novel, Demby stages in stylized fashion the tragic rain-soaked scene of Laura Segre's funeral at the Protestant cemetery near Rome's Piramide. Pages later, he returns to Laura's death, this time translating and reproducing an entire feminist editorial written by his friend, the Italian filmmaker and novelist Lorenza Mazzetti. Mazzetti, as you may know, passed away last month in Rome at the age of 92. She played a key role in the new cinema as a filmmaker in London, where she moved as a young woman in the early 1950s after having survived a wartime childhood massacre in Tuscany of her family, relatives of Albert Einstein's, by the Nazis. Mazzetti channeled this trauma into her prize-winning debut novel, 1961's Il cielo cade, The Sky Falls. In the catacombs, Bill Demby cites Mazzetti's complete article about Laura Segre's death from Mazzetti's column, Chi dice donna, published in the leftist weekly, Via Nuove, to which Pasolini was also a regular contributor. Bill Demby translates for the reader of the catacombs that Mazzetti's weekly column derives from an Italian expression, Chi dice donna dice danno, which boils down to women mean trouble. Mazzetti's manifesto about male dethronement and her view of its role in Segre's suicide is notably interrupted in the catacombs by Bill Demby after 3 paragraphs. At this point in the text, Demby inserts a breaking evening news report that 100 Algerians were just killed in Iran by French militarists. The juxtaposition of this journalistic content, translated by Demby from the communist newspaper Pace Sera for inclusion in his novel, collides with Mazzetti's editorial, literalizing these untimely deaths' imbricatedness across micro and macro borders, and prompting the question of what is to come, of futurity. Lorenza Mazzetti's Marxist critique of patriarchy's role in Segre's suicide, a symptom of what Mazzetti terms the sadism of capitalist bourgeois marriage, then resumes in the catacombs for several pages before ending the chapter. Though Demby notes just prior to citing Mazzetti's article that he is, quote, strangely disturbed by its content, in surface fashion, he does not elaborate upon his own affective response. Rather, he gives Mazzetti the last word. He turns to Mazzetti and other words to eulogize and ponder their friend Laura's suicide in the context of the struggle for women's emancipation. The Catacombs is a novel with feminism on its mind, in resonance with Doris's character's critical insights in this novel of selectivity, where Bill Demby curates the day's events for his assemblages. There are ample references, for example, to the first woman in space, an Italian Congress for women's rights, and the advent of the birth control pill. Post-war Rome is hardly a neutral landscape in these struggles. Rather, its honeycombed layers bear the traces of a long history of empire that is enmeshed with its fascist colonial incursions into North and East Africa and their afterlives. As I mentioned, William Demby's journalistic writing took him on assignment a decade earlier to post-colonial Ethiopia and Eritrea in 1950, where he bore witness to the suffering and instability left in colonialism's aftermath, in contrast to claims of Italian benevolence or brava gente, as scholars including Angelo Del Boca and Claudio Fogu have theorized. Demby's reportage on Ethiopia and Eritrea for Epoca magazine, then a glossy publication akin to Time and Life magazine in the United States. Demby's reportage was paraphrased and published by the communist newspaper Paese Sera, much to Epoca's chagrin. Epoca's editors included a note in their next issue stating that they had discontinued Demby's future articles in the series to show their distance from such publications. Significantly, Demby was then approached in Rome by a US intelligence agent who warned him to take care about where his work was appearing. This Cold War episode resonates in subtle ways with Demby, including Paese Sera's coverage on Algeria in the Catacombs, announcing his own long-term readership of the paper alongside Lorenza Mazzetti's column in the leftist weekly Vie Nuove. Living abroad as a Black artist in these years was, of course, hardly an apolitical experience. By the mid-1960s, the FBI had created a file on Demby, now available through the Freedom of Information Act. Demby's file states that an unnamed informant alerted the FBI that Demby, quote, had established a wide circle of contacts in left-wing circles in Rome, Italy. The source claimed that, quote, Demby knows everybody and is married to an Italian who operates a well-established literary agency in Rome. Demby travels frequently between Rome and the United States. The file concludes that, quote, the above is being directed to the attention of the subversive control section. Demby's file, like so many other Black American artists and intellectuals in this period, affirms the inextricable relations between Cold War geopolitics and cultural production in this era of red baiting and unprecedented surveillance of Black artists and intellectuals on a global scale. In the Catacombs, Demby invokes, but does not expound upon, the strains of living abroad as a Black writer during this temporally dense period of anti-colonial and anti-racist struggle, what he terms a Janus time. Bill Demby repeats as a kind of mantra that his focus is on time, always time, il tempo, sempre il tempo. Living in Rome among empire's ruins and registering his own times, Demby laments, quote, it is cold, the Caucasian world is cold. Then alludes to the Sunday school lyric, yellow, brown, and black and white, all are precious in his sight. News of US Jim Crow terror appears in the Daily News in Rome. Again, articles which Bill Demby blurbs and sometimes cites in full in the catacombs and in his characters' minds in the novel within the novel. Bill Demby subtly telegraphs his own anguish at living abroad at the height of the US civil rights movement when he stands in front of the Vatican thinking, quote, I am alone with my thoughts, the shame and guilt and anger of these weeks for those terrifying news pics from Birmingham of fierce gum-chewing police dogs, that is policemen, enforcing the law with Nazi efficiency, gazing up at the window of the dying Pope, wondering why I am here. William Demby returned from Rome to the US to participate with his family in the historic 1963 March on Washington for freedom and jobs, an experience narrator Bill Demby also recounts in the novel. At the March on Washington, Bill Demby muses in the catacombs how only yesterday he was in Rome and that he does not yet, quote, feel part of this well-groomed, well-behaved revolution, which feels, quote, like a public relations stunt owing to photographers and TV cameramen historifying the event. The catacombs surface aesthetic omits further commentary, but nuances Black exile as a position of estrangement and profound critical distance. The catacombs chronicles an era rife with assassinations, mass deaths, and suicides. In an interview given late in his life with Silvia Lucchese, Demby reflected on living in Rome in the 1960s as a Gothic time that seemed to demand death sacrifices as a means of leaping over an abyss into an unknown future. William Demby, for his part, self-fashioned artistic methods in Italy to survive and to thrive, with the project perhaps, as Bill Demby asserts in the catacombs, of reinventing reality. In a handwritten note among his papers from Rome, Demby pondered his own role as a Black American writer. He muses, quote, I am Italo, Negro, American, to which he draws a line to a hand-drawn box in which he qualifies this thought, listing his influences and contemporaries. Quote, Silone, Moravia, Pasolini, living in this Italian room, this Italian universe, I have been influenced by all. Put simply, Demby's work in this period would not have emerged in the same way had he not left the United States. His career in Rome revolutionizes his artistic production, endowing it with an ever outward moving global orientation that is attuned to deep time and so to futurity. Though the writers and artists I explore in my project were surely living la dolce vita in Rome, my book complicates a merely celebratory take on living abroad, given the Black freedom struggle at home and the often fetishizing reception these artists received in Italy. I am not arguing for a stable, tight-knit Black community in Rome, but rather a dynamic, affiliative network, one marked by comings and goings, as with the artists pictured here, among many others who worked in Rome in this era and left their mark on Italian culture. Black Americans' collective presence and cultural labor in post-war Rome estranged racial apartheid in the United States and catalyzed plural modes of being in and seeing the world that circulated in transnational media cultures. Demby's cultural works, layered temporalities and difficult forms born of Black critical cosmopolitanism and artistic might warrant continued contemplation as we imagine and activate heterogeneous futures. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Melanie, for this really incredible talk and really deep dive into such a layered history. I have a whole book full of notes that I've taken this evening, just in looking through this conversation. And I think that there's so much that is within it. I want to open up to questions from the audience, and maybe while we're waiting for a few questions to come into the Q&A box, one thought that comes to mind, I know that you've probably only scratched the surface in regards to African-American artists and writers and thinkers that were present in the context of Rome in this period. And it's a question I've always had for myself also, as to why is it that the kind of, I guess, exploration of the legacies of Black expats in Paris tends to be something that is hyper visible, while the context of Italy in that same time period tends to be very minimally covered and actually very underknown. I mean, and this is true amongst many of us who have some work and research to sort of think about this space. I'm imagining this is something you've considered, but do you have a sense as to why there's so much more emphasis and knowledge that's been placed on the context of Paris in this period versus Rome?
Yeah, it's a really compelling question and asks us to think about discursive formations and the way in which a body of knowledge sort of builds up and coheres around itself in regards to Paris. And this is, again, recent history, going back to mid-century. It's not so long ago, but the Black print cultural record surely positions Paris and Rome often in tandem and featuring artists working in both metropoles. And in correspondence, you see, I gave the example of Richard Wright and Demby's friendship, but you see James Baldwin, for example, coming to Rome in these years, and a kind of exchange between the metropoles. So too, we might think of the landmark First Congress of Black Writers and Artists in Paris in 1956, which is so well known. The Second Congress is held in Rome just a few years later, reported on by Demby in 1959. But again, it's the way in which bodies of knowledge sort of cohere and build, and the hope is, of course, that I can make the case that there's rich and ample work to be done in this period in Rome, and even thinking comparatively between Rome and Paris, and in London for that matter. So certainly the way in which this knowledge falls to the wayside fairly quickly, is always something to attend to, but the historical record is there of this rich and dynamic scene. The other matter is that in this period, of course, of desegregation, there's institutional support in the way of fellowships being granted to Black American writers and artists for the first time in this period, but it is a kind of dynamic coming and going. So maybe an artist comes to live for a matter of months or a year or two, and somehow that is not taken up in the same way as the long-term residence of, say, Baldwin in Paris or Richard Wright in Paris. But again, I see so much interplay between the metropoles, and even a figure like Ada Bricktop Smith, the renowned club owner and singer who had a longtime club in Paris. She sets up through the whole 1950s in Rome, where she's on the Via Veneto in this period. So again, I see a lot of dynamism there, and much work remains to be done on the writers moving through this space, which I'll just briefly say has different dynamics in terms of its colonial history than Paris, of the fact of the thriving film industry, for example, of having been foe turned ally and heavy American presence in Italy after the war. So they're really interesting dynamics driving the art being produced there as well.
And I think that what you mentioned in regards to the colonial history, I was also wondering if that plays a really strong role in terms of the sort of the moment, the post-colonial moment of Paris, and really thinking about the ways in which that opens the doors to a different kind of Black presence that I think maybe didn't happen in the context of Italy in regards to a post-colonial moment here, which happened in such a different way. But that's really, there's many different leads and really intriguing things to look at and think about. We have one more sort of broad question, which I think is an important one too, that maybe allows you to talk a little bit about previous research as well. And so what drew you to take this project on? So I guess in terms of also what some of your previous research might have informed and influenced this direction.
Yeah, I mean, as a literary researcher, I've always been drawn to experimental narrative and to experimental temporality in particular. So how writers are able to give voice to lived experience in the manner of temporality, and how that gets manipulated and is experimented with on the page. So that when I first read William Demby's The Catacombs, that really drew me into this research, because it is, as I'm arguing, a surface aesthetic that gives us certain reference, but so much work is put upon the reader to sort of make sense of the landscape, make sense of the cohorts, and so on. So I think that was a major impetus, just reading that novel, trying to get a sense of the scene in Rome in that period. So too with Demby's passing in 2013, I learned in his obituary that he had left behind an unpublished novel, King Comus, which he'd labored on for 25 years, but remained unpublished when he passed. And I, through a series of events, made contact with Demby's son, James, about this novel, just wanting to know what had happened to it. And that is when James, as I mentioned, very generously welcomed me to work with his father's papers. And then together we were able to bring the novel into print with Ishmael Reed's publishing company in Oakland.
Yeah, that's really incredible. That's really incredible. So we have another question that asks, that says, a central reason for many American artists to relocate to Europe is America's persistent anti-intellectual cultural bias. The question is, how much did this influence Demby?
Well, as I tried to suggest, from the time he arrives in Rome, he falls in with a really powerful revolutionary set of interlocutors, moving into this commune on Via San Teodoro, reading Gramsci at the dinner table and having deep intellectual, robust conversations about anti-fascism and the role of art in moving the culture forward in the wake of fascism's defeat. So his marriage to Lucia Drudi, again, as a deep intellectual and artist herself, again, I see her as such a central role in immersing Demby into Italian life and philosophy, and into a literary set of circles. So in as much as they're moving through artistic circles, film circles, literary and philosophical circles, it's really a dynamic time. And a time of such great global flux for a sort of refashioning and radical reimagining of ways forward through one's art, through one's cultural production.
Oh, thank you. And I think we can sort of maybe take on one last question. And I thank you all for writing these questions. There's a lot of really amazing ones. But one that I think has also struck my curiosity as well, because you talked a little bit about performativity. And there's one question that asks you to talk a little bit more about the performative quality of Demby's writing, especially regarding Rome as a big artist theater. And I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit to that in regards to the performativity that you mentioned before.
I love the framing of that question. And yeah, Demby himself speaks about sort of being at an impasse in trying to write a new novel. So this is his second novel, and he sort of drafted some other projects that don't come to fruition in the period. And then he sort of decided to do what he was doing in the movies, he says. So he begins sort of scripting the scenes for the novel within the novel, and then calling attention to the act of writing a novel. So the scenes with Doris and the Count, they might be ready to have a big argument. So the narration will literally say, the spotlights on, the scene is being set. They're literally theatricalized, and he gives direct homage to Pirandello, 6 characters in search of an author. So he's really playing with this idea, blurring the lines of his fictional characters with his own lived experience and asking us to think about, what is real, what is reality. So that performativity, he literally uses that language of staging and dramatization, even as these other filmic elements like montage with the textual collage give us this time space compression that we associate with film. The character Doris is just an incredible character, and I could give a separate talk about her. But again, she's a Black American dancer working as an extra in Cleopatra, but she gives incredible, sort of schooling to Bill Denby and the Count, and then writes these long letters home to her mother, which really are like incredible dramatic monologues that Denby's written for her.
Thank you so much for diving into this, and we really want to thank you for your time and sharing this research with us. Incredible, and we want to also wish you the best in coming back over to Rome to dive back into the work that you were doing at the American Academy in Rome. And I hope to have the opportunity to meet with you there when you arrive. And so I want to thank all of NYU Florence's staff for helping us to work on setting this up, and to the directors allowing us and putting together this framework for us to be able to share this wonderful talk with all of you. And I want to thank all of you for taking the time to join us. I invite you to take a look at the Black History Month Florence.com website, which has the full program. I think there's probably still about 30 events left on the calendar for this month. And most of the virtual content we have recorded, so it's available after the fact as well as a sort of archive to be able to spread some of these conversations, which I think are really in need of being had in this context. Thank you so much, Melanie, for joining us, and thank you for your research. And truly fascinating, and I'm so excited to see its development moving forth.
Thank you, Justin. Thanks for your time, everyone.
All right, everyone have a great night.